Hi, everybody. Very pleasant good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of BHBA Family Law Presents Direct Examination. Along with Lauren Youngman from Youngman Reichstein, I'm Dan Bemmel, financial advisor and certified divorce financial analyst. During each episode of our program, we explore our guests' personal and professional history and dig into meaningful legal topics. Please continue to join us for our upcoming episodes, always at 12:30 p.m. On Zoom on the first Wednesday of the month. Upcoming guests are Stephen Yoda, Evan Itzkowitz, and more. Lauren.
Thank you, Dan. First, housekeeping. You will receive your MCLE certificate shortly after the program. Please take a moment to complete the survey that's included with your certificate. Our sponsor is White, Zuckerman, Warsofsky, Luna, and Hunt. White, Zuckerman, Warsofsky, Luna, and Hunt provides a wide variety of resources to complete almost any project, large or small. They also provide traditional accounting and tax practice services. We invite you to contact them to discuss your specific accounting needs and learn how they can be of service to you. Okay, Dan, let's get started.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. Today, we're joined by Adam Lipsic. Adam is a partner at Hersh Mannis, where he spent his whole career from intern all the way now to partner. From highly complex litigation to straightforward premarital agreements, Adam focuses on keeping things moving quickly and quietly. We're going to spend some time getting into his process and approach, but in many ways, he comes across as really a lawyer's lawyer, almost a throwback who seems to just love being an attorney. So let's start there. Adam, do you love being an attorney?
Do I love being an attorney? Yes. There's some footnotes to that, but the answer is generally speaking, yes.
Sure. So why? Open that up a little bit. Why do you love it? Why have you stuck with it?
Well, I'm assuming you're asking because of reasons other than bringing a smile to my mother's face when she gets to tell people that her son is a lawyer. So yes.
Well, if you weren't going to be a rabbi, sure.
I like to problem solve. And I think being a lawyer is really about problem solving. I like that it's within sort of a set of rules that you're given and how you can make those rules work for the problem that you're trying to solve.
What about family law specifically? What do you like the most about practicing family law?
I like that it's not monotonous. I like that it's at the intersection of everybody's lives and sort of covers every area that they have and all the things that they have going on. We have cases, Lauren, I'm sure you know as well, like we have cases where we have criminal issues that come up, or we have tax issues that come up, or we have property issues, whatever they may be. And it is certainly not boring. It is not for the faint of heart either. But my dad is also a lawyer. My dad's a transactional attorney, and that's just not for me. I like that we get to deal with people. I like that we get to be in court. Not that should always be the first resort, but I like that aspect of the practice. And I just think family law, you get to cover so many different areas that it stays interesting.
So your dad was a lawyer. When did you start? So you obviously were aware of the law and knew that as a career growing up. When did you start thinking about it for yourself, or maybe seeing it as a path for you?
I think probably as I was quite a precocious child and tended to have opinions about many things and get into verbal arguments about many things. And so it's kind of always just the career path sort of made sense. Specific moment in time would have been summer, I think it was summer after 10th grade, which is when the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, and I was taking a AP European history class, and I was chosen to be defense counsel for Louis XIV in a mock trial on treason, and there was a not guilty verdict, and I was very excited about that, and I said, I guess it's time to be a lawyer.
Speaking of that verdict, do you ever wish that you could do jury trials, or are you happy with our bench trials in family law?
So I'm happy with the bench trials in family law because I don't think there's a place for jury trials in family. But in general, I think I would love to do a jury trial at some point. It's a completely different animal. And I did, when I was in law school, I did a lot of the trial team competitions on behalf of the school. And those were all jury type scenarios. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it because it's a very different skill set that sort of comes into play with that.
Were you a good student in school, or was it, I mean, going all the way back, not just in law school and doing trial con?
Yeah, I would say I was definitely a good student. Middle school, high school, I had challenges like anyone else in general, but I think I was generally speaking a good student.
What was hard for you back then?
I don't think educationally anything was that hard. I think more the school aspect of, particularly in middle school, fitting in and those sorts of things, that took some time to happen. I was a little overweight as a child, and that was something to deal with. And actually, my now partner, Neil, I've known Neil my whole life. I've known him going back to his daughter and I were in Mommy and Me together. That's a whole long history and story, but I was very friendly with his daughter. I had a very nice relationship with Neil, and Neil had sort of always taken me under his wing for whatever reason. Now I'm grateful for it, but for whatever reason. And when I was struggling with some of that stuff, he said, if you ever lose some weight, we'll go shopping. We'll get you a new wardrobe. And if those of you who are watching know Neil, he's impeccably dressed at all moments. So that sounded like a great idea. And I remember when it happened, sure enough, followed up with me, and I still have some of the stuff he bought me to this day.
That's awesome. That's awesome. When was that?
That would have been summer after 8th grade. So heading into 9th grade, heading into high school.
Wow. That's really formative. Was that, so by the time you get to college and you start thinking about the law seriously, what went into that process? Was it still finding a place to fit in? Was it more school driven? Walk us through how that actually went down.
So I started working when I was 16. I mean, going back to before then, I started working at a baseball card shop. I was very, very interested in baseball, loved sports, like most young boys growing up, had the fantasy of playing professional sports.
Oh, you too?
Yeah, it's just, it's shocking how that happens for everyone. But, I started working for a sports agent when I was 16. And so from when I was 16 to when I was 19, I was doing that. And I thought, maybe there's a little bit of the legal aspect of that. I was doing baseball only. So there was the arbitration aspect of it. And I thought maybe that would be an interesting maneuver. Had a little bit of experience playing, some college baseball. Quickly realized that was not going to be a long-term thing. And that I wanted to sort of pivot off that and go towards a more traditional route, if you will. And just realized that, legal career was probably where I was heading.
Before we talk about the beginning of your legal career, what was your college experience like? Where did you end up going, and what was that experience like for you?
So I grew up in LA, and I went to Brentwood High School, and then I was deciding where to go to college. I grew up a little bit in a bubble, if you will, and I was like, USC sounds great. And my parents were very adamant about my going away for college and getting grounded. And they thought the Midwest would be a great place for me to go. I was fortunate enough to get into Michigan, and I went to visit Michigan with my father. I remember I came back and I said, I still think it's SC. And my parents said, that's wonderful, but if you go to SC, we're not paying. And I quickly said, no. Michigan sounds great. It was the best decision I ever made. So that was really
the best decision they ever made.
Yeah, both of us.
Yeah. So what was it like? You said you were a good student. Was it law school right away? Was that always the goal still? Even as an undergrad, what was going on in college for you?
So Michigan has an undergraduate business program, sort of like Wharton. And you do your first 2 years in regular school, then you go to the business school and you graduate with a BBA, and you apply in your sophomore year. If you get in, then you go into that school. Pretty competitive. I applied, I took the classes, I got in, and I didn't read the fine print. And I found out I couldn't go abroad if I was to go to the business school. And my sister had gone to Wisconsin, and she had gone and got to live in Italy for 4 months. And I said, well, that's not fair. I want to have my chance to go abroad. And so I said, you know what? No, thank you to the business school. I will go major in English. And then I got to have my time abroad. in terms of what school was like, I always thought my education at Brentwood was harder than my education in college. But adjusting to the cold weather was definitely something to get used to. And I still remember, I negotiating with some of my professors about attendance at class, and maybe you let it slide. And if I do okay on the first exam and get an A, maybe you continue to let it slide. I'll prove my worth here.
So no matter what you
It was
did, at least
really
you didn't have to
cold.
go outside in the cold.
Yeah, it was really cold those winters.
Really cold.
Yeah.
So during this time, summers, whatever, you're working for a baseball agent. What kind of turned you off about that world? When did you decide to pivot?
Well, it's interesting given where I've found myself, but on some level, I felt that it was too much glorified babysitting. And so I decided to pivot. And I remember having a conversation with Neil, and he said, "What are you doing this summer?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Come hang out with me." And I like to say I've been hanging out ever since.
Well, so what does that mean? What does an intern working for Neil do?
Well, back then it was different. When I first started working for Neil, it was law offices of Neil Raymond Hersh. And I remember I would go pick him up. I mean, I effectively carried his briefcase. And wherever Neil went, I went, which it was really an eye-opening experience. I got to go, if he went into chambers with a judge, he would be bringing me where he was going, client meetings, depositions, whatever it was, I was there. And I just tried to sit there and, be a sponge and try to take in as much as I could take in.
What about that experience hooked you and kept you coming back?
To the extent you guys know Neil, I loved being with him. And then I found that the area of the law was really interesting. I thought, I'm a people person. I got to deal with people all of the time. I found every case was a different story. Like, again, it wasn't monotonous. And it was something new to learn. And I like learning new things, new businesses, new X, new Y, whatever it may be. And so I just found it a really interesting thing to do. And Neil was definitely doing it at a high level then, just like he is now. And so everything was interesting.
In terms of law school itself, was there anything that ever tempted you to look at a different practice area or a different career path?
I don't think anything really tempted me to look to something else. I always sort of just assumed that I would end up here and this is where I would be working. When it came time to figure out a job scenario, that was a little bit of an interesting situation, which was I was getting job offers because I was doing the trial team stuff and people would come and they'd watch, and I was getting job offers to go do other things. And the one place I wasn't getting a job offer was here. And I couldn't understand it. And at that point in time, I scheduled a lunch with Neil, and I scheduled through his then assistant Beverly. And I remember we went to Kate Manalini's, we were catching up, just talking about life, talking about school, talking about everything. And I kept waiting for him to say, "Do you want to come work for me next year?" He just wasn't doing it. And I didn't know if he was messing with me. I didn't know what was going on. And so I remember towards the end of the lunch, I just said to him, I said, "So am I coming to work for you next year or not?" And he said, "Yeah, I didn't tell you." And that was my job interview.
It's a good job offer.
It was great. I don't even think we talked terms. We just were like, okay, we have a job. We'll figure it out.
So what were those first years of practice like when you actually got your ticket and could do more than be a bagman?
Well, so it's interesting, right? You come out of law school and you don't really know, like I knew the trial skills because I was doing all the trial team stuff and that translates. But you don't really know how to practice and the day-to-day stuff and procedure and those sorts of things. So, I am a self-professed workaholic. It's like a 12-step thing. I'm working on it, but, there's no substitute for hard work. So I was working all the time, weekends, this, that, just to try to absorb as much as I could and to try to take from the mentors that I was fortunate to have what I could to then incorporate into my practice. And whether that was, in-house or whether that was from learning from other lawyers that we were engaged in, cases with, I just tried to absorb what I could, again, being a sponge to the best of my ability.
Was everyone at the firm at that time supportive?
So you mean of me being at the firm?
Yes.
So the direct answer is no, and I think I should give you a direct answer because it's a direct examination. But I think, at that point, Neil had merged with Joe, and then it became Hersh Mannis, and then it became Hersh Mannis and Bogan. I'm convinced that Joe thought I was here purely because of nepotism the first few years of my working here. And I really only worked on cases with Neil and with Judy initially. But then Joe tasked me with the first case, and I think he realized that I wasn't here just because of nepotism. I could actually do stuff. And now he's become, one of my closest confidants and friends now. So, I was very fortunate that I came in with one mentor in Neil. I gained another one in Joe, and even to a certain extent, at that point in time, Judy Bogan was a partner of the firm, and there's a ton I learned from Judy. And I tried to take each piece from, pieces from each of them that I could incorporate into making me, into the lawyer I like to think I am today.
So let's talk about that from a practice standpoint. Let's kind of go in that order. From a practice standpoint or a business standpoint, what did you learn, or what do you carry with you the most from Neil right now?
I think personality-wise, I'm probably closest to Neil. So I learned from Neil and watched how he interacted with people and treated people and spoke to clients, handled clients, those sorts of things. I tried to incorporate stuff on that same level that I learned from my grandfather over the years. And then, custody stuff, I think Neil's one of the best ones out there. So learning from Neil on that was a tremendous source of knowledge. From Joe, I learned finances. I learned the business of law, how to run a law firm, and manage those sorts of things. From Judy, I tried to take procedure and things like that. She was so well versed in those sorts of things and able to, help me learn that, because that's not really stuff you learn in law school. So, circling back to the question of like, when you come out of law school, were you ready to hit the ground running? Kind of, the answer is no. And I had to learn those things. But I tried to take, pieces from each one of them and meld them into me.
So can you tell us about the first real case that you worked on?
So there's a sort of a distinction between the first case I worked on, which would have been during my time when I was still sort of a law clerk or, a summer intern, whatever it may be. And then sort of when I came in and was practicing law. But the first real case when I was practicing law was a case that we had with Steve Kolodny on the other side. And it was a very large case, highly litigious case. And that was, family law boot camp in every sense of the word, because every single thing happened in that case that could possibly happen. And so I really had a tremendous amount of exposure to so many legal issues in just that case.
What'd you learn from opposing Steve Kolodny?
Steve was a fantastic lawyer. Difficult to have as opposing counsel for sure, but honorable. And if he told you something, he meant it. And he was terrific to me over the years. And I really only have good things to say about Steve. But I learned how you could have an RFO over anything every day of the week. I learned how there was discovery done in every different way in every vehicle. I learned subpoena. I learned everything in part by watching what they were doing on the case that we had.
So now you spin all the way forward. Do you like the kind of keeping up with the development of the law? I know today we sent out a couple of new cases. Do you like that part? What do you take away from stuff like that?
Well, I think you have to stay current on some of the things that are coming out because the law is evolving, it's developing, and you have to know where the changes are. I think the two cases that I sent you, one had to do with sort of a People versus Sanchez issue, but it was most people think about that in the context of a custody evaluation, and this was in the context of a real estate appraiser that was testifying, and I thought that was super interesting. So that was something that I sent out. And then the other one that I sent out, I think, was Marriage of Whitman, which dealt with, and these were the two cases, I think, from this year that were non-DV related. So I thought that was, where I would focus my time. But Whitman was interesting because it was a hedge fund guy who got into some trouble, and then they spent a ton of money on legal fees defending himself in the criminal side of the case. And then it was the interplay with that and how the court allocated the debt for those legal services. And I just thought it was an interesting read.
Do you ever do appellate work, or are you interested in doing appellate work?
I have done 2 appeals cases. Not my favorite part. I prefer the trial court work, but I do find it interesting.
Since we're talking about cases, let's go deeper into some of your actual cases, and hear some of these great stories that you've been kind of alluding to, I guess we could say, so far. So let's just start with the crazy, maybe a few crazy things. What's the craziest thing? You talked about how you learned from Kalani there can be an RFO for anything. What's the craziest thing that a client has asked you to actually argue for or go get?
There was a case that I had where the parties, very well to do, they lived in a beautiful home in Brentwood, and they had in their family home, each of the child's bedrooms had hand-painted murals of the Harry Potter. They were Harry Potter themed hand-painted murals. And our client was out of the family residence and in a rental. And she wanted us to go to court to ask the judge to give her enough money to have this person come and do hand-painted murals in the rental home. So that was certainly an interesting foray.
What about on the witness stand? What's the craziest thing you've seen there?
So that story would go back to dealing with the same case I had with Mr. Klodny's office. And there was a trial, and one of the issues had to do with a paramour of our client. And she was testifying. She didn't quite make it to the witness stand the first couple times that she was supposed to be there. One time was a no-show, one time she fainted in the restroom. But on the day of her testimony, she was being examined, and the lawyer for Mr. Klodny's firm was asking her questions, and she was giving answers that were contrary to what he expected to hear. And at one point in time, he finally just was like, "Mrs. So-and-so, didn't I ask you this and you told me that, that, and why is it different today?" sort of stuff. And she pulled out of her purse, "You mean these questions and answers that you gave me?" That was kind of a drop the mic moment.
So you're not supposed to have an actual script on the witness stand, is what you're saying.
Not a good move. No. And you're certainly not supposed to show it if you do.
Show it to the judge. What about in other settings, like in a depot or client meetings? What are some of the crazy things in those settings?
There was an occasion where Neil and I were in a deposition, and custody was an issue in the case. And it was alleged that the other party had a porn addiction. And that party, we were going over some of the things that would relate to that. And that party bluntly looked at Neil and I and referred to us as porn amateurs. So that was certainly an eye-opening experience. And there was then an occasion where I remember we were taking the deposition of a professional athlete, and the athlete didn't show up on time. Clock was ticking. The lawyer was there. The lawyer didn't know where the person was. And 2 hours later, the athlete showed up with no shoes on and smelling like alcohol, which made a very interesting deposition because he thought everything was a joke. So,
My goodness.
Yeah.
Just like you said in the beginning, it's definitely not boring when you practice family law.
You can't write the stuff that we see.
You also said earlier, you touched on the fact that, all sorts of issues intersect with family law cases. What's the most interesting legal issue that, you've had to learn about for one of your cases?
You mean in the context of a different area of law?
Or really in any context, but sure.
Well, within the area of, family law, I always find relocation cases and or business valuations very interesting. Particularly the business valuation stuff, because there's just so many different ways that can get carved. Within, I guess, other areas of law, I've learned about, I had to deal with an anti-SLAPP motion in connection with a surveillance issue, which was kind of interesting.
What happened there?
Well, that case is still ongoing, so I don't want to comment on that too much. But that was an interesting thing to have to learn, because it certainly was not within our area of the law.
What, being at a firm like yours and dealing with public figures is a little different. I think that's a different approach. How have you learned to deal with the publicity side of what you do, either in the room with the clients or kind of externally and generally when you're working on those cases?
So, we see people when their lives are, in some respects, falling apart, oftentimes. And when you're dealing with the interplay with, somebody who's a public figure and that's going on, oftentimes people want to try to resolve as much as they can before any news gets out. Sometimes that's not possible. Working with, the publicists and sometimes, crisis management people and things like that, you just have to lean on your resources and figure out how your client wants to handle that situation, if at all, within the public sphere. My tendency is not to deal with publicity with cases, because I find that people do not want that.
When have you had to get out of cases? How do you get out of a case? When you have to get out of a case?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, right? What is the reason that you have to get out of the case, I think, is the first part that you have to assess. Is it something that can be done just telling the client, we're really not seeing eye to eye on how to move your case along? And then the question becomes, are they going to go willingly, or, do you have to file a motion to withdraw? It just depends on the circumstance.
Any stories or anything crazy, going back to like story time, anything crazy when you've had to find your way out of a case?
I don't know that we necessarily found our way out of the case, but I do remember early on in my career having a case where I was working with Joe on a case, and there were allegations that our client had a drinking problem. And we sort of suspected it may be true. There was some conversations that we had with the client that gave us an indication that may be an issue. We had scheduled a meeting with the client to discuss with that person what impact that could have, particularly vis-a-vis, custody issues. And there was a 10 o'clock meeting, and we were waiting around for this person to show up. Didn't show up. We were calling relatives. We were calling whatever we could call. We got a call from the person's brother that informed us that he had been arrested on the way to our office for a DUI. At that point in time, I think we sort of realized, I think this is not, we're not seeing the same way about how to handle this case. And that was one that we had to get out of.
I mean, okay, so of all these crazy stories, you still have one that tops them, and that's how you met your wife. Can you tell us how that started? Start from the beginning. Who are the clients? What was going on with the case?
Well, so I have been very fortunate in the sense that I did find my wife through working in family law. She was my opposing counsel on a case, and it was a very hotly contested case. I'm not going to name names, but the party, Tara, was representing the man in the case, and we were really, this was, a few years into my legal career, and we were the lowest members on the totem pole of each, team that was built at the two different firms. At that point in time, my wife Tara was working at Trope and Trope, and it was Sorrell's case, and Lori Howe was working on the case, and then there was Tara. And at my office, it was Neil and Judy and then myself. And because of how hotly contested the case was, Tara and I were spending a lot of time talking on the phone, trying to work through issues that were coming up in the case. And it was a scenario where we had just spent so much time speaking to each other that we got to know each other. And I remember I hadn't taken a vacation the first 3 years that I was working here. And I finally decided I was going to take some time off around the holidays. And, she said something along the lines of, well, who am I going to speak to while you're out? And I said, well, you'll talk to Neil or Judy. And she said, well, what if I just want to talk to you about the issues? And I said, well, you can still call me. And I remember, again, it was around the holidays, and I'm Jewish and she's Christian. And I remember saying, what'd you get me for Hanukkah? And she said, I don't know, what'd you get me for Christmas? And I said, well, why don't we get together and exchange gifts? And
Smooth on.
thank you. And I don't know whether either one of us really thought it was a date, which it wasn't at that point in time, but we went out and we kind of realized, oh, we might like each other.
Are you sure you didn't think it was a date? You
I
wanted
am,
it to be a date?
I am certain when I went there, I didn't think it was. By the end
Yeah,
of it,
we'll
I
put this
was like,
in
well,
a cross
maybe.
exam soon. What are the ethics of dating? Let's unpack that. What are the ethics of dating opposing counsel during the case?
So it's a no. It's frowned on.
Oh, that's not good.
It is
not good.
It's frowned on. So I
Okay,
do
frowned
remember. I do remember having to research the issue before we move forward. I do remember, having to set an appointment with Neil to talk about it. And I do remember, Tara and I discussing, okay, well, if we really want to try to date, we have to talk to our bosses and we have to disclose to the clients because we had done our research. And I remember making an appointment again with Beverly to have a drink with Neil. And I am firmly convinced that Neil thought I was quitting at that point in time. And I met him to have a drink and we sat down and I ordered a drink because I was nervous and Neil was drinking iced tea. And he goes, what do you want to talk about? And I said, I got to talk to you about Tara. And if you know Neil cracks jokes all the time, particularly in uncomfortable situations. And he said, well, you didn't get her pregnant, did you? And I said, no, I didn't. But the problem is I may want to one day. My sense of humor as well. And Neil loosens the tie. And he says, have you researched this? And I said, yes, I've researched this. And I said, here are all the things that we have to do. And, to Neil's credit, he said, if we need to leave the client, we will. We want you to be happy, which was really sweet. And I remember Tara went to Sorrell with the same story. And Sorrell was like, we love Adam. Don't worry about it. We'll talk to the client. And both of us, disclosed to the client and got the waivers and sort of, the rest was history. Both of our firms thankfully got out of that case. But
anyway, separate from your issues. Yeah.
What was it like? What was it like asking your client to sign that waiver?
Super awkward. Super awkward. But, thankfully the client said that they trusted me and it was going to be okay.
Thank you for
so that part's history. What happened? Do you know what happened to the parties or whatever happened in the rest of that? So that was the launching pad for your family.
Yeah. So I know that Tara's old client is now deceased. And I remember doing some research, a few years ago, Tara and I, we have 2 kids, very happy together. And I was just wondering, what happened to these 2 people that brought us together? I just was wondering where it went. So I did a deep dive on the internet. And I found my old former client and I found that she had opened up a business. And to my shock and surprise, the name of the business was the same name as my daughter. Oh. First name and middle name, which.
Oh, that's weird.
It was beyond cosmic alignment with these people that brought us together. But it was just a very weird real life connection.
Wow.
That's so strange. I want to get into practice and how you actually run a case, but you've talked a lot about your mentors and people you've learned from you mentioned Sorrel. Is there anything you learned specifically from Sorrel or from anybody else in that generation that you'd want to pass on to others?
Listen, I could give a name call of a bunch of attorneys that I've watched over the years and worked with on cases and tried to take things from, whether it was, Dan Jaffe and Bruce, whether it was Dennis Wasser or Bruce Cooperman, whether it was even Manley and Mel, all of the old large firms, where you watched how they handled things. And everybody was a little different about how they handled cases. But I think that's more generationally, on some level, what's missing from our generation, Lauren, in terms of practitioners, is that mentorship is not necessarily there because the business model has changed from some of these law firms with the associates, with all the training, to a lot of people going out and doing stuff on their own.
Mm-hmm. Do you see that as the only big change going on right now versus when you first started out?
No, I mean, I think the practice of law has evolved on a number of levels. I mean, we're glued to our smartphones. Everybody can find us whenever they want, and with what they pay us for our services, there's an expectation that there's an immediate response. And I think that is a very difficult part of us trying to navigate being a practitioner today, is how you handle that. And quite frankly, I'm not the best at it. And my wife would be the first one to tell you I'm not very good at it, because the boundaries is something I am still working on.
So what is your overall approach when you take on a case, when that client's sitting across from you in your office? How do you describe what you're going to do for them? And once you get into it, how do you try to actually move the case forward?
Well, so first of all, I try to assess whether the fit is right on both sides. Some clients want a certain approach to a case that I may not necessarily agree with, and I know, maybe this is not the right fit. I certainly believe in trying to resolve cases before you go to litigation. Sometimes that's not possible, right? There's a custody issue that has to be dealt with right away, those sorts of things. I understand that. But, I believe that most cases should be resolvable without litigation. I mean, you have an issue like a business valuation where the valuations, there's a wild swing. I mean, that's a harder thing to sort of navigate. You have a relocation case, somebody's, in LA, someone's moving to New York. You can't say, well, drop the kid off in Illinois or Indiana. It just doesn't work that way. But I do believe in trying to work with the other side to see what we can work through short of litigation. Sometimes things have to be figured out by a judge.
Do you find that you are often facing the same opposing counsel, and so you've had time to build that relationship where you can work together with the other attorney?
So yes, I think, the family law community is small in many respects. And when you deal with the kinds of cases that we normally deal with, oftentimes you see the same opponents on the other side. And so having worked here for as many years as I've worked and been exposed to all of the people, whether they were coming up in those, sort of larger firms that I was mentioning, and whether they're still at them or they've started their own, or whether they are now, off on their own, I've been able to develop relationships with a lot of lawyers at a lot of different firms. And I think that that's only, a benefit to our clients and to the practice in general. I'm able to pick up the phone and call someone most of the time. And I know sort of, who I can deal with and who I can't, and who I can trust and who I can't, and how you have to operate slightly differently. I still want to believe that people are going to be honest with you and transparent, because our job is hard enough, but it's not always the case.
So how do you handle those cases where opposing counsel perhaps is not trustworthy, or it's someone that you haven't developed a relationship with?
Those are cases where you have to paper the file more, and, do things in writing and have confirmations and things along those lines.
What about
the relationship side?
Oh, yeah,
How do you
go ahead,
build
Dan.
that with an attorney? How do that you don't necessarily know?
So I think, look, I'm a big believer in at least extending the initial olive branch. here's a sign that you can trust me. Let me see some reciprocation that there's trust here. And, you start to try to build that and go from there.
You talk about the types of cases that the firm takes and practicing against similar people, similar opposing counsel. Does that create different challenges sometimes? Does it make it harder to settle cases ever?
From my experience, no, because I think now where I am in my practice, I know, one, you have to have a distance between what the case is and then what's going on at the lawyer level, right? You don't want to be in the fight yourself, because then it becomes toxic and it bleeds into other things. So you have to have a distance and understand that the case is the case. So you leave that part over here and you have your relationship over here.
So then what usually gets in the way of the case? Sorry, what usually gets in the way of the case settling or going smoothly?
Complicated issues or complicated people. Sometimes you get both, and that's a double whammy, and that's very hard to navigate.
So like what are those issues? Usually?
Well, I just mean in the context of, there could be a complicated person who is taking, comes with their set of issues that you have to navigate, which makes that harder to settle that issue. There could be a complicated issue like a business valuation, which you have a wild swing, and sometimes those have to be litigated. Someone else has to make a decision because the two people just won't move.
What about when it's the parties? What's the difference between representing the difficult side or opposing the difficult side?
So I have found that oftentimes in family law, I'm going to say, crazy wins, because on some level, the more that you are reasonable, the harder it becomes when you're trying to negotiate something. And in those circumstances, you can't negotiate with crazy. That's when you have to go to court and let a judge make a decision. So that's sort of what I've taken away from the complicated people, is sometimes it's just, you're just not able to reach an agreement and someone else has to make a call.
So is that, going back to something you said before, is that if you find yourself representing the crazy side or the demanding side, if you want to be more generous, what do you do? What do you do differently if you know you're on that side of the fence? And do you just go to court? Do you just know it's time to litigate?
No, I don't think that's necessarily the answer, right? So the first thing I'm going to try to do is, this person hired me for a reason. I'm going to try to see if I can break through to this person. If I'm struggling with breaking through to the person, I may bring in someone else. Maybe, maybe they don't want to hear it from me. Maybe having a second person, they hear it from a second person, maybe it starts to resonate. Maybe then it's finding a mental health person to bring into the equation to try to deal with some of the issues that are coming up. It depends on what the issue is that's making the person complicated.
How do you deal with it? How do you deal with those situations now? Do the toxic parts of the job still stress you out? How do you manage that?
So I think when I was a baby lawyer, I had a very hard time processing the distance that needs to be kept, right? You're in this fight, but it's the person's fight. It's not yours. And I was having a hard time compartmentalizing the stress I was feeling from the job versus taking a step back and saying, this is not my issue, right? It's their fight, not mine. I think I've gotten better at that over time, and I'm virtually certain that there are probably assistants in my office that would say that I've learned how to cope with some of the stress better now than I used to. But again, it's at the end of the day, people are hiring us to help them and try to solve a job, and so I take on that responsibility not lightly. And there's no substitute for hard work. So you have to just keep at things until you try to find the solution.
What's changed? What would your, coworkers who've seen you maybe chill out a little bit, what would they say, or what would you say has changed between then and now?
I think part of it's time, part of it's learning, learning my my role in what we're doing. I have more tools in my toolkit, if you will. I think being married, I think having children, I think all of that gives me a different perspective on what we do and on my level of patience in my job versus, being able to leave it here and take it home and not take it home. I beg your pardon. On occasion, I do take it home and I try to be better about that. But that's the best, I can say is I just have a little bit better perspective now, having done this for all these years.
Are there some attorneys who you think are very good at that compartmentalization, or do you think it's pretty universal, at least in family law practice, that you're aware of?
I definitely think that there are lawyers that are far better at it than I am. That is for certain. But I do think part of it comes with the territory. It just does.
How do you try to do it? Like, do you have actual time set aside? Do you put the phone down? How do you compartmentalize? Like lock it in a cabinet or something.
I do not lock my phone in a cabinet. Tara would love it if I did. My children would probably love it if I did as well. But I've learned to try to take time for myself, which I have to do now very early in the morning before my kids are up. But at least I have that private time for myself. I've tried to learn to put the phone down at a certain hour. Joe's been on me about that for years, about just, at some point, turn off the phone. You get to have a life too. The answer is I just do the best that I can.
How about let's go back to the practice standpoint. How do you think opposing counsel would say that you've changed as you've matured in your career?
That's a great question. And I would probably say you'd have to ask them. I don't know. I think my approach to cases has been pretty consistent. I think just my perspective has changed on certain things.
We're getting towards the end of the time that we have. I want to talk a little bit about the future and kind of what you see. Lauren asked a really cool question about the landscape of family law. Where do you see that going, especially in our community, LA, obviously Beverly Hills, West Side? How do you see the business of law and the landscape amongst the firms changing? You got a lot of time, you got a lot of runway left. How do you see that playing out?
I think it's a really interesting question and an interesting time, because a lot of the older generation of firms, some of them started to go away just by natural progression. A lot of people are leaving and starting their own stuff. So you see a lot more solo practitioners. I, for one, I like working with people and I always want to be part of a firm. So I still see the model being there in terms of, smaller boutique style firms that will still exist. I think it's been interesting. You've started to see some of the bigger law firms develop family law practices again, although they used to be shying away from them. But you've seen those sorts of firms come back into the landscape. And I think that will continue. The question is whether that starts to swallow up all of the boutique firms or not.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think these larger firms have sort of started to break back into the family law world?
I think it's because there's money to be made.
Well,
as you think about developing talent, I think that also calls back to something you said about being in this environment where you can learn and then pass it on. What do you look for? What do you think younger associates should be looking for in a mentor that you were lucky enough to find? And what do you look for in finding talent as you think about managing a practice and building your roster of people?
So I think the most important characteristic is work ethic, actually, which is really hard to judge. When you're interviewing someone, you don't get to see that aspect of it. So on some level, I think you need to have trust in what you're seeing with the person, their personal skills, all those sorts of things, see them work, and then see if the work ethic is there. Because some of the skills you can teach, right? You can teach people about the law. You can teach people about, how to write pleadings. You can teach people even with trial skills. Although some people, have the personality and the wherewithal to be trial lawyers more than others, those are still skills that can be acquired. Work ethic on some level, I think you either have or you don't. You either have the desire to want to do the job, whatever it takes, and that you really can't assess till people are there and you see what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. Yeah, it's always hard to find that at the beginning and to match that up. Do you think the format, the setting, the solo versus the large boutique, large but single focus in family law versus the conglomerated practices, do you think the trend's gonna continue? And do you think that's good for the clients? Are there pros and cons to those settings for the clients?
I definitely think there are pros and cons because in the larger firms, there are synergies that are there because you have other areas that come up in your life that they can help with, or you have issues, again, at the intersection of every other area of the law, you have other people you can rely upon within the firm to go pick their brain about, there's a tax issue that came up. If your firm has a tax department, go to somebody in the tax department and there's built-in information that's right there and readily available to you. So I do think that there are synergies that are beneficial in the larger firm setting. I personally, at least certainly right now and at this stage of my life, I prefer the boutique aspect of things with the singular focus.
What do you want your legacy to be in the family law community? Have you started thinking about that at all? I mean, you're on the younger side of the guests that we've had on, but have you started thinking about impact and what you want that to look like over the next part of your career?
The answer is I have not begun at all to think about that. I think I'm still building my career and hopefully will leave some sort of a legacy that will be positive, but I don't know what that's going to be yet.
All right, let's start thinking about it. We can start thinking about that together. The next time you're on, we'll delve into that.
Nice to know I might be invited back.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Instead of looking towards the future, which can be a little scary, if you could go back in the past and talk to your younger self when you were just starting out, when you had just passed the bar, or really to any new attorneys that are just starting out in family law, what advice would you give them, and what would you say?
So I would say, again, there's no substitute for hard work, but the juxtaposition with that is you need to develop a work-life balance. I was not very good at it, and I think that if I could go back, I would have worked a little bit more on that. I'm still working on it.
Okay, fair enough. I guess, at this point, we've wrapped it up, and we really appreciate you being so open with us. Everyone, please mark your calendars and join us for our next episodes. They're all going to be at 12:30. We have Stephen Yoda on June 5th, followed by Evan Itzkowitz and more. We want to thank Genna, Rin, Jose, and Belinda at the bar, the Family Law Executive Committee, which is currently led by Ava Jahanbash, Ashley Kwan, and of course, all of our section sponsors. Most importantly, thank you to Adam for being here and for sharing so much with us.
Thank you very much, Dan and Lauren. I appreciate being here.
It was fun, man. Thanks.
Thank you.